All right. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this, but my name is Jesper. And I've basically worked with GraphQL for 6 years now. So I think the intro text is like from last year, but that's okay. And yeah, I've worked with GraphQL for 6 years, and I've been working at Spotify since January this year. And this is me at 10. I'm the handsome guy on the left there, and I'm playing a board game that was kind of a gateway drug to a really, really dangerous world for kids, Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I'm saying this because the text below here says they're not burning Bibles. So at the time, the Danish media was they were a bit curious about this role-playing games and how that would affect young people. And there was like a lot of mysticism around that. And so the media was pretty much all over the place when it came to role-playing games. Now, a lot of the mysticism around things like that have been removed, of course. And today, we're going to be looking at some of the mysticisms that are around onboarding. So onboarding teams to federated setups. I'm going to do that by sharing a few thoughts and some tools around how to actually improve your onboarding, or hopefully help you in the process of onboarding more teams. I'm going to do that by going on a bit of an adventure. But before we get started, I just wanted to shortly talk on imposter syndrome. Now, some of you have probably already heard about imposter syndrome or have experienced it yourself. And imposter syndrome is best described as a behavioral health phenomenon described as self-doubt of intellect, skills, or accomplishments among high-achieving individuals. Now, it's the feeling that you get when you start doubting your own skills among your peers. It's the feeling that someone will find out that you're pretty poor at your job, and they will find out soon. And it's also one of the most common sources of stress in the tech industry. All right. Now on to the adventure. So every good adventure, of course, needs a quest. So everyone who's actually played role-playing games or any kind of game with a mission or a quest will know the dopamine rush of actually solving a quest, being on a mission, doing something that's actually worthwhile. Now when it comes to federated GraphQL, once you've actually set up the federation setup and you've done your first service or converted your old monolith, the first actual quest that you will see becomes pretty obvious: scaling the ownership. Now, once you've set up the federation setup and you actually want to take advantage of the flexibility that federation gives you, and you basically want to do that by spreading the adoption of federation across multiple teams. But then again, why should you? Because why not have everything running at one team? Why not have one team build and handle the entire infrastructure around federation and just do all features when it comes to federation? Let's have a look at some of the benefits to actually spreading federation towards multiple teams. So first off, bottlenecks. So if you have like a single team, a lot of organizations have like single teams that are doing the first prototype for federation and doing the first implementation of whatever setup you have, if it's router or something completely different. And that team, if they keep the ownership of the federation setup, will become a bottleneck, of course. If they are involved in every single feature that has to be deployed, if they are involved in every single schema change, every single subgraph, this team will become a bottleneck over time. And of course, you don't want that. Second of all, speed. You probably know this guy. So splitting up the graph in different areas and responsibilities will help us increase the actual development speed. Because feature teams will then be able to actually focus on the areas that they need in order to have delivery of a single feature, for instance. Third up, shared ownership. So having multiple teams take responsibility of the API can prove beneficial, both in terms of reducing the bottlenecks and increasing the speed of development, but also by having things like conversations around how to evolve the actual API. So if you have multiple teams that are actively engaging in these conversations, it can help you pretty much shape your API into becoming the best tool that you actually would need. Finally, cognitive load. So if you have a single team that's pretty much responsible for everything, they have to know everything about the API. They have to know every single part of the domain for every part of the API. Now, by scaling the ownership, it allows you to only actually worry about the parts of the graph or the API that you actually have deep knowledge around. So by spreading the ownership, you allow teams to actually just be involved in the parts that they are experts on. All right. Now, every great adventure needs some kind of obstacle that needs to be passed in order to actually achieve the quest. So let's try to dig into those and why they might pose a threat for your actual scaling of federation. Now, this might be a kind of a hot take, but people. Don't get me wrong, people are great most of the time. People can do pretty amazing things. People can come up with solutions to most of the problems that we have, but people are also unpredictable. And you can't really ignore the human factor when it comes to onboarding people. When you're looking into expanding your federated supergraph, you will most likely face challenges like fear, uncertainty, doubt. People will give you feedback that you might not like. And when you're onboarding people onto your setup, you're basically also putting an additional load on these people that they might not want. So you're asking them to participate in a setup that they didn't really ask for. And so you will probably get pushbacks in terms of, why are we even doing this? We don't have time for this, we're doing features. And rest is better, things like that. So people are definitely a danger to your scaling. All right. A lot of times in our daily lives, whether it's working as engineers, working with product, or even managing people, we have to navigate through a lot of technologies, a lot of processes, strategies, things like that that are constantly evolving. Now, oftentimes when you're attracting new teams to work on a common API, you're basically also likely to expose them to having information overload. Now, working with new teams means that you're actually requiring them to absorb a lot of information around new technology, best practices, namespacing, edge cases, or security. And this, of course, when it comes to federation, just adds to this information overload that pretty much everyone is experiencing already. Okay. Okay. So, you built the thing, and you want to keep it under control. You want it to be stable. You really don't want it to fail, right? So you start at looking into governance. You work out boundaries, you make rules, you define best practices, and you enforce them. But having complete control over every part of the process can provide a risk. And that's both in terms of onboarding, but also in terms of evolving the graph. So it removes the flexibility that was once the selling point of federation. It makes onboarding new teams more tedious, as teams can experience or get the perception that putting out new features can be difficult, that everything has to be reviewed, or that the governance process is just cumbersome. So every time you're doing that, potentially if you're doing governance, you could have security but at the risk of speed. Okay, so we talked about the quest, and we talked about the risks that are associated with getting to the quest. Now, in order to actually handle those risks, we of course have weapons in our armory. And so let's have a look at some of the weaponry that we have available for defeating these risks and help us in accomplishing the scaling of our federation setup. So first off, let's talk about style guides. Now, at Spotify, we use style guides for a few different reasons. First of all, we use them to document the decisions we have made on the schema itself. And we use it as a way to avoid having the schema drift. So basically, when we're doing features across multiple teams, if you're doing something that's already been done elsewhere in the schema, we don't really want you to invent something completely new to solve the same issue. So by having the documentation, it basically allows us to set out some best practices for that. For new teams that are onboarding to our setup, it also works as kind of a rule book. So it helps us onboard new teams by having both a set of rules that they need to follow, but also for them to have a point of reference on how to actually do things. It helps new teams doing the onboarding process actually being sped up by having like a set of predefined ways that we are doing things, which means that every time a new team gets on board, they don't really have to worry about how are we actually doing pagination, things like that. So that they don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. And finally, the style guides actually help us in the governance process, as due to the fact that we have a set of rules, when we're doing governance and we're doing like schema reviews, having a set of rules that we have agreed upon actually allows us to just have a simple checklist of, hey, this is the way that we used to do things, or that we're used to doing things, and you have to abide by these rules. So making the review process much, much easier for us. Okay, so our rules are basically split into 3 different parts: basic, intermediate, and advanced. Now the basic rules, now those cover things like casing, how we do sorting, how we do pagination, if you should do pagination. Hint, you should almost always do pagination. And the use of descriptions. And for us, descriptions are pretty important. We need, of course, descriptions as much as possible. But these are like basic rules for the style guide. Now, intermediate rules, those are things like nullability. How do we actually perceive a field as being nullable or not? How do we handle versioning of fields or queries? How do we do wrapping? We do like object wrappers across multiple subgraphs. So how are those actually being handled across multiple teams? And finally, how do we do deprecation? How do we actually handle having potentially 5 years of backward compatibility, and how do we actually handle deprecation not being forgotten? Now finally, the advanced rules, and those cover things like doing custom errors, using union types. We actually use custom errors and custom error types quite a bit. So having unions and how we are using unions is actually a pretty important part for us, but it's also pretty advanced. And then finally, how we actually do complexity calculations and how the tagging of those and using directives to handle complexity calculations are actually being used. Now, these 3 different parts are all part of the same style guide, and the style guide is like a document that's publicly available internally at the company, and it's evolving over time, so it's run through a democratic process where everyone can basically propose changes or have edits if it's just approved by enough people internally at the company. All right. So when you're onboarding, one of the key elements for the new team is actually getting a sense of ownership. Now, this can be achieved in a multiple number of ways, but one of the most efficient ways is by involving the new contributor as soon as possible in the process of defining the schema. This can be done through workshops. So workshops on building first schemas for a new subgraph can provide a way to both democratize the process of actually getting a new schema online. It adds a sense of participation in the involvement of the schema, but it also adds a way of actually being able to introduce these rules that you might have set forth to the new team being onboarded. So that basically gives you the advantage of having these rules introduced to the new team fairly early on in the process, making governance quite a bit easier in the long run. Now, another way of actually kickstarting this process could be by embedding someone already involved in working with GraphQL or Federation into this new team. We've done that a couple of times. And this accelerates both the learning process of having someone already knowing how the schema works or how GraphQL works, embedding in a new team. So having that transformation or that transferal of knowledge was what I was meaning. But also by a way of actually educating this new team on the rules. All right. Schema change proposals. Now, figuring out how to handle schema changes early on will definitely save you some time later on. Now, there are a ton of different ways that you can do schema change proposals, and they basically range from really, really simple to really, really complex. Now, you could store your entire supergraph in a repository, and everyone could do like pull requests, requesting a change towards the schema. I've seen companies do that, and that could work for you. You could have a change proposal that's running through like an RFC process where you request some comments from other teams working with GraphQL or Federation, and then after you've gained the confidence or gotten any comments or feedback on your schema change, you could actually move it into implementation afterwards. Or you could have like a centralized governance structure, and the reason for the funky icon here is that at Spotify, our centralized governance structure is actually called the Illuminati. And yeah. But you could do that. So have like a centralized governance structure that's ensuring that your schema changes are being reviewed consistently over time, both before they're actually being implemented, but also having running reviews on already existing schemas. Now, the important part around schema changes isn't really how you actually handle it, because there are like a ton of different ways you could do it, and there's no one-size-fits-all. But the most important part about doing schema change proposals is actually that it allows you to handle changes in a structured way, which also means that you get a better chance of avoiding this schema drift over time, because since you're consistently reviewing your new schemas or reviewing the existing schemas, you will have a much easier time handling these small issues of something drifting away from what could be your standards. Okay, now let's talk about linting. Now, linting is actually one of my favorite weapons in the armory, and I'll tell you why. As an engineer, if you're working on a schema, you might end up with having a ton of rules or best practices that you might not be aware of, or if you're at a certain age, you might not remember. So even though everyone might have agreed on a certain set of best practices when it comes to like naming conventions, sticking to those rules might be a lot to keep in mind every time you're constructing something new. Now, in the process of building and approving a schema, this might be resolved simply by having this governance group telling you that, hey, your naming is off, and we have decided we shouldn't name things using every other character as a large character and every other as a small character, or something like that. So you might have a governance structure that can help you with doing that. But what if you could actually handle these things before you even turn in your schema for review? Now, linting basically handles that by having an automated set of rule checks and providing you with the feedback that you need even before your schema is passing through peer review. Now, there are a few open source solutions for handling linting. I'm not going to mention them here, though. We have one at Spotify that we use, that we've developed as well. And if you're using Apollo's GraphOS, they have some linting tools in there as well. I think there was a talk around that yesterday, actually. All right. So we talked about the quest. We talked about the risks. We talked about the weaponry for being able to pass on through the quest. Now, before we actually arrive at our final destination, I just wanted to summarize a few things and a few learnings from applying some of these tools. Now, whenever you're actually introducing changes into your federated setup, communication is always the most important first step. Ensure everyone knows why you're doing something new before you actually focus on how. So whether it's actually handling deprecation, if you're introducing new rules, if you're the way that you're handling schema reviews, if that's changing, everything now affects multiple teams, which means that you have to change your communication form to actually adapt into handling multiple teams. Now, once you've communicated your changes and the reasoning for doing so, and people understand why this is happening, try to move on to automating things as much as possible, because this will also allow you to not become a bottleneck in terms of handling governance or handling reviews, things like that. So automate as much as possible, get an automated deprecation routine, set up automated linting. If you can, find a way to actually automate doing rule checks, for instance. Now, the second point, which is also the most important part here, is focus on making new teams' jobs as easy as possible. Try to avoid adding more complexity to your team's setup. Instead, try to focus on solving any obstacles that they might have, or any obstacles that might come up when you are onboarding a new team. The point here is, do whatever you can to ensure that your contributors don't have to worry about the inner workings of your schema, how the schema composition works, or having them remember a ton of rules. After all, most of your contributors should be able to focus on modeling and exposing the domain that they are experts in. Okay, so we made it through to the end of the line of what makes up this great adventure. Now, in the beginning, I had a slide around imposter syndrome, and there's a reason for that. So the reason being is that the process of onboarding new teams oftentimes results in you being the expert of knowledge. So if you're the person or the team that's onboarding other teams, people will turn to you for knowledge around things. How are things being done, or what are the rules? Now, oftentimes this can actually lead to you starting to question your own abilities. And so in order to avoid that, I just wanted to mention that the tools I've talked about here, if you're trying to implement every single part of those, it might be overwhelming. So don't try to implement everything at once. Pick out a few of those, try them out, adjust along the way, and just get started with doing onboarding. Thank you. All right. And just finally, I have a topic table at 1:15. So come talk to me about linting and why it's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesper.